Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Casey Darling, a senior here this year. I'm studying political economy and am from Fort Collins, Colorado, and I'm very happy to be here at Hillsdale for my final year. It is my pleasure today to introduce Nick Lloyd. He is a senior lecturer in defense studies at King's College London, based at the Joint Services Command and Staff College in Shrevenham, Wiltshire. Dr. Lloyd earned his PhD from the University of Birmingham and subsequently taught at the Royal Air Force College in Cranwell, Lincolnshire. He is the author of 3 books: Lose 1915, The Amritsar Massacre, The Untold Story of One Fateful Day, and 100 Days, The End of the Great War, which was recently named one of Maclean's best reads of 2014 and a must-read by the New York Post. He is currently writing a new history of the Third Battle of Ypres, in addition to a biography of Sir Michael O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab during the First World War. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Nick Lloyd.
Hello, good afternoon. I am the last Englishman you will hear at this event, so it's really wonderful to be here at Hillsdale, and I would like to thank Dr. Jeffrey, Dr. Casper, Dr. Arn for inviting me here today, and to the Center for Constructive Alternatives for hosting this event. It is rare indeed that one gets to share the stage with such esteemed fellow historians and before such a distinguished audience. I have been asked to give a talk on how the Great War ended, and I think it is entirely appropriate in this centenary year to remember how this awful conflict came to its conclusion. Indeed, this is a subject very close to my heart. From an early age, I've known about the war. Contrary to most people's understanding, my view was not conditioned by the great battles of the Somme or Verdun or Passchendaele, as we talked about yesterday, but of how it ended. Or perhaps I should say how it had never ended, especially for my late grandmother, Gladys Mary Cottrill, who never forgave Germany and the German people for the loss of her elder brother Thomas, who died in September 1918, barely 6 weeks before the Armistice. You can see Tom there, the last photograph that was taken of him in 1918. And of course, you may not be able to read it, but the picture on the right is the telegram that they received from the War Office, the worst telegram in the world. Tom's story became, in a sense, the inspiration and guide behind the book, and it was born out of a desire to find out more about how he died and what it meant. Tom Cottrill was just 19 years old when he was killed in action just outside the small village of Gouzeaucourt, southeast of Arras in northern France. He had been conscripted a year earlier and served with his battalion, the 15th Royal Warwickshire Regiment, in Italy before returning to France in the spring of 1918. Tom's loss always haunted my family. On the morning of 27th of September, his mother, Florence, woke up with a searing pain in her head. This is according to family legend. At that very moment, Tom's battalion was taking part in the Battle of the Canal du Nord, one of a number of climactic battles on the Hindenburg Line. When she had recovered, she had a dark sense of foreboding that something had happened. And then, on 23rd of October, 19 days before the armistice, the telegram arrived from the War Office confirming that Private George Thomas Cottrill had been killed in action. Tom was killed in the last great campaign of the First World War, what has become known as the 100 Days, or the Advance to Victory. It refers to the decisive last phase of the war on the Western Front, between the massive tank attack at Amiens on 8th of August, when the Allied advance really got going, and the armistice on 11th of November, when it came to an end. This is actually a total of 95 days, but historians have always called it the 100 days, not because they couldn't do maths, but really to make a conscious connection to the 100 days against Napoleon in 1815. One of these things that drew me to this period, and certainly drew my publishers to this period, was how poorly these battles have been remembered. Indeed, it's been a favourite lament of generations of British historians to bemoan the lack of appreciation of what really happened in the final months of the Great War, particularly the leading role that the British Expeditionary Force took in it. As long ago as 1978, the historian John Terraine complained that the final campaign of 1918 is virtually an unknown story, and this remains the case today. After all, who has heard of the Battle of Amiens, or the Battle of the Sambre, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, or the Meuse-Argonne? They have, it seems, been lost to history. My book, 100 Days, was an attempt to allow a new generation to rediscover them, and is on sale after this talk. I just want to throw that one out there. It will be, I think, very interesting to see what place the 100 Days has in the official commemorations of the Great War that we are now about to go into. In January 2013, the president of the Western Front Association in the UK, Professor Peter Simpkins, wrote to the Times on the best way to honour the dead and called upon the government to include the Battle of Amiens in its commemorations, which had hitherto not been included. He claimed that to accord Amiens a victory, the same status as the first day on the Somme, a defeat, would be a significant step in the right direction. The current official programme is as bizarre as marking the centenary of the Second World War by commemorating the fall of France, but not D-Day. In a strange coincidence, all the main protagonists had their own reasons for forgetting the 100 Days. In Britain, the memory of the war, as Lord Egremont talked yesterday, would always become associated with the Somme and Passchendaele, the great attritional battles of 1617, and almost no amount of revisionist history has been able to shift that. For us, the truth of the war was mud, blood, futility, and an awful lot of poetry. Victory in 1918 wasn't really part of that myth. In Germany, the last battles remain under-researched and little known, understandable, I think, given the old stab-in-the-back myth that claimed the German army had not really been defeated in 1918, but been betrayed by traitors, Jews, Slavs, Bolsheviks at home. Therefore, there was really nothing to be learned from the final phases of the war because the German army didn't really lose it. If anyone should have remembered the 100 Days, it should have been you guys. The arrival of US troops in strength for the summer of 1918 played a key role in the defeat of the German army, something that is, I think, too often underappreciated by Eurocentric historians. Yet America was not to remember her role too fondly, as she lapsed into isolationism and retreat after 1918 and condemned President Wilson for dragging them into someone else's war. A related point you sometimes hear, and I've certainly had this, is that to accord the 100 Days some kind of victory, heroic status is misleading. Between mid-July and November 1918, the Allies sustained upwards of 700,000 casualties. German sources are at least 800,000, although we cannot know for sure. Given such heavy losses, how is it possible to call this period a string of victories? Yet when I wrote this book, I think it led me to challenge many of these assumptions. Firstly, I believe that the 100 Days is really important, and it's only by examining this period in detail will we understand how the war came to an end. The Germans may have lost the war by July, when their final offensive petered out, but the Allies had not won it, and the ferocity of the fighting was testament to how far the war had left to run. The book begins with what in hindsight emerges as the real turning point of the war, the Franco-American counterattack on the Marne on 18th of July that wrested the initiative away from the German army. I then chart the development of the grand Allied counterattack that took place over the coming months, telling the story of the momentous events that ended the war, the stunning success at Amiens in August, the advance to the Hindenburg Line, the climactic battles at the end of September, and finally the pursuit and retreat throughout October and into November. The men responsible for these operations were on the screen. These are the chief donkeys, if you will. On the left, the French commander-in-chief Philippe Pétain, dour, savior of the French army after the mutinies of 1917, trying to shepherd his shattered army home. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, head of the British Expeditionary Force, ever optimistic and bullish, and at the head of an army reaching its peak of effectiveness, yet undermined at home by a Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who loathed him. On the right, you have General John Blackjack Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force, inexperienced and aggressive, who found European-style trench tactics too cautious and thought breakthrough operations led by American riflemen would win the war. And finally, in the center, the small chap, the Allied Generalissimo Marshal Ferdinand Foch, a committed Catholic who had lost his only son in 1914, yet was still devoted to the offensive after all these years. Although Foch was their nominal superior, he really had more of a coordinating Eisenhower-type role, chivying everyone along and trying to get them to work together, something that was not always easy with such headstrong commanders. Nevertheless, in 1918, they work well together. Following the counterattack on the Marne, Foch wants to maintain pressure on the German army, so he orchestrates what he calls a series of movements intended to seize key objectives and keep the initiative. Although he was hopeful of great results, he had little idea that they were on the cusp of the greatest series of offensives of the war. This is a map of the Western Front, as you can see. The shaded areas are the areas that the Germans had occupied during the spring offensive, when they bring all their troops back from Russia and try and win the war in the West. By July, their offensives had ground to a halt, and then the culminating point changes and the Allies mount their offensives. I think a number of themes emerge from the book. The way in which the Allies were able to fight in those last months, the importance of courage and determination of the highest order right to the very end, and the nature of German defeat and the destruction of her army. Turning first to the Allies and how they fought, I think there is no doubt that by the summer of 1918, they had created an effective and particularly brutal way of fighting that proved its worth time and again. Someone asked yesterday about what did they learn over the 4 years. Well, hopefully in this period you can very much see the degree to which they learn. Losses may have been substantial, they always were, but they were more manageable than ever before, and moreover by 1918, attacks usually met with progress, sometimes significant progress. The Americans met with less success, but this was primarily due to a lack of artillery, a lack of air power, and logistical constraints. The 100 Days witnesses some outstanding examples of Allied tactical superiority, particularly the attack at Amiens, which kicks off Foch's series of offensives, a series of movements, on 8th of August. This was a crushing blow to German hopes of holding on to their gains of the spring. Some Australian troops behaving in a very undisciplined manner on a tank. Covered by a thick fog, and using the latest artillery techniques that negated the need for a preliminary artillery bombardment, surprise had finally returned to the Western Front. Spearheaded by the elite Canadian and Australian Corps with 500 tanks, the Allied attack broke through the line east of Amiens and almost destroyed the German Second Army. In all, German losses were as high as 27,000, with the loss of 400 guns, and all in a single day. It is no wonder that General Ludendorff, the German commander, would subsequently call it the Black Day of the German army in the Great War. It was after Amiens that the 100 Days really gets going. The German army begins to fall back, while the Allies follow them as closely as possible. In September at Saint-Mihiel, the US First Army goes into action, the first time that a unified American force had gone into battle on the Western Front. There is no doubt that German army morale begins to, I think, plummet quite alarmingly at this period. The hopes of victory, which had been raised to a fever pitch at the beginning of 1918, now produced a crushing sense of desperation and fatigue right across the army. All the high command could do was pull back units into their last main defensive position, the Hindenburg Line, and hope to hold on. If that position fell, the road would be open all the way to Berlin. This is an example of a German postal censor, which illustrates the declining morale. I think was very useful for giving a sense of what the German army really begins to go through. Yet, however bad German morale becomes, much depends on how long the Allies could maintain their advance and keep the Germans on the run. Logistics were crucial to this story, and the difficulties of moving armies at speed during this period has, in my opinion, never been fully appreciated. If the 100 Days was anything, it was a triumph of engineering. In their path, the Allies found wrecked villages, lethal booby traps, destroyed wells, torn up railways, and felled bridges. As the French commander Eugène Debenay wrote, the terrain they crossed was full of shell holes, all the houses destroyed, ruins, nothing but ruins. The destruction they encountered was methodical. Even the fruit trees were cut down. However, through a combination of hard work, good leadership, and honed military skill, the Allies were able to keep going. For example, between August and November, the Royal Engineers built over 330 stock span or rolled steel bridges, approximately twice as many as they had erected in the preceding 4 years of war. It was this kind of improvisation that was vital to victory in 1918. Gradually, as the German retreat gathers momentum, Foch begins planning for a major set-piece operation to get through the Hindenburg Line. When he had planned his series of movements in July, he had no thought that they would lead to such decisive results. But the speed of the German retreat now called for a new plan. By mid-September, Foch finalizes a four-step offensive, with operations being conducted right across the front, but all working towards one objective: to attack key positions and stretch German reserves to breaking points. I'm not sure whether you can make out the blue arrows, but it shows what Foch is trying to do. He's effectively trying to pinch out the German bulge into northern France. That was about as close as a flank as you could get on the Western Front, certainly in the south. On 26th of September, the French and Americans would go forward in the Meuse-Argonne north of Verdun to try and sever German rail lines and seize the city of Sedan. The following day, the British and Canadians would push onto the Canal du Nord west of Cambrai. On 28th of September, the Belgians, the British, and the French would mount an offensive in Flanders. And finally, on 29th of September, the British Fourth Army would assault the Hindenburg Line along the crucial St. Quentin Canal. Because of the logistical strains that such a massive series of operations would demand, it was necessary to mount them on successive days, one after the other. Foch's strategy was, I think, in many ways quite brilliant. He has finally moved away from the vain and costly effort to reach deep into an enemy's position, the longed-for breakthrough that never came, and understood that in the context of 1918, the width of the attack was critical. He wanted to attack at different parts of the front at the same time, trying to overwhelm enemy defenses and prevent reserves from being able to intervene, because German reserves cannot be in 4 places at the same time. In late September, this has spectacular results. The Americans would kick off this massive series of offensives, driving through the battered woodland of the Meuse-Argonne, an environment that some people have said is reminiscent of the Wilderness Campaign of 1864. You can see something of it in the photograph that I've just put up. The story of the Meuse-Argonne, I imagine, will be familiar to at least some of you. General Pershing was faced with the brutal reality of modern combat against a skilled opponent, and despite outnumbering their enemy many times over, the attack quickly bogged down. The ground was awful. As one veteran, Claire Groover of 79th Division, later recalled, in the confusion of the attack, barbed wire across no man's land, continuous shell holes, forests, machine gun fire, companies were broken up into little groups. Over the next 3 days, his regiment suffered 1,200 killed, wounded, or missing. In his sector alone, he counted over 113 machine guns in fixed positions, supported by at least half as many movable weapons. Simply nothing had prepared for them the intensity of firepower on the Western Front. Pershing was so incensed at the failure to progress that he demanded increased efforts, sacking commanders wherever he could and ordering renewed attacks. The problem was that without the sophisticated logistical support and overwhelming artillery fire available to the British and French, US operations would struggle to suppress enemy defenses. Was it then a failure? Just another one of those horrendous Western Front offensives that went nowhere? Not really. The fact that the Americans were there in such numbers, there were over 1 million men in France now, was proof enough of US commitment and will to victory. As Crown Prince Ruprecht, a German army group commander, noted grimly, "The Americans are multiplying in a way we never dreamt of." Elsewhere, pressure on the German army was now becoming intolerable. Further north, the British and Canadians had managed to penetrate the Hindenburg Line on 27th of September when my great-uncle was killed, and a key bridge was secured at Riqueval on the St. Quentin Canal 2 days later, which sent shockwaves right across the front. Because obviously now that you have a bridge, you can get tanks across. For the German army, the failure to hold on to the Hindenburg Line was devastating. Defeat was now inevitable. Thousands of deserters were skulking behind the lines, while the number of reliable troops and experienced NCOs was dwindling to dangerous levels. Had the war gone on for much longer, who knows what would have happened. Erich Ludendorff, the German First Quartermaster General, would now make a fateful decision. There he is, not a man you'd like to meet in a dark alleyway. It's a terrible thing to say, but all German commanders of the First World War look like this. It was on 28th of September, the third day, that Ludendorff realizes the game is over. It's 6 o'clock that evening as news comes in of a massive attack in Flanders that Foch had orchestrated. He goes to the Chief of the General Staff, Paul von Hindenburg, and tells him that they need to do something immediately. They need to sue for peace. Why had Ludendorff made such a decision? How could this hardened Prussian warlord suddenly give in, especially if his army is still fighting very, very hard, and especially when the German army is everywhere on occupied territory? The controversy over this decision has never abated. It's sometimes been suggested that Ludendorff had some kind of nervous breakdown and collapsed in his office, foaming at the mouth. Although this was denied, there does seem to be something in it. In August 1918, staff at the German High Command were so worried at Ludendorff's mood swings and erratic behavior that they arranged for an eminent German psychiatrist, a Dr. Hockheimer, to visit the general. And you can imagine the scene. As far as I know, I'm the only person to have used the letters that Dr. Hockheimer writes to his wife about this period, and they offer a really interesting insight into the psychological state of General Ludendorff. When Hockheimer meets Ludendorff, he finds him overworked and exhausted. He wanted the general to lessen his frantic daily schedule, so he had the most beautiful flowers brought into Ludendorff's office, which he hoped would lighten his mood. Quite amazingly, Ludendorff seems to have responded well to this. By mid-September, aides were noting a transformation in his general demeanor, which had been improved by less work in the afternoon and more sleep, which Dr. Hockheimer carefully observed. This is some quotes that you can find in Dr. Hockheimer's diaries. "My patient is doing better each day. The calming effect of my words has made me quite happy." Hockheimer gives Ludendorff a book to read called Rhapsodies of Joy by Paul Steinmuller. It's not a title I have particular familiarity with, but Ludendorff apparently finds this hard to understand and incomprehensible. However, the worsening news at the front means that Ludendorff's mood deteriorates significantly in late September. On 28th of September, which is the key day, Hockheimer writes one line in his diary: "It storms at Ludendorff from all sides." Whether he collapsed or not is impossible to say. Hockheimer thought not, but there is no doubt that Ludendorff lost his nerve at a critical moment, and thus sparking off the process of peace negotiations that would bring the war to an end. From this point onwards, the long, tortuous story of the armistice begins. The German government sends a note to President Wilson on 3rd of October asking for peace negotiations based on the 14 points. They did this, unsurprisingly, to try and split the alliance, hoping Wilson would conclude a more favorable peace than they would have received from the French or the British alone. But this was not to be. After various correspondence with Wilson trying to ascertain whether this is the real deal and whether it is an honest approach, he finally agrees to grant an armistice should a number of terms be fulfilled, such as the evacuation of occupied territory and the cessation of submarine warfare. The key question was whether the Allies could trust the German government. On 21st of October, Washington sends its final note to Berlin, making it clear that it would not deal with any German government unless it was democratic and had the military authorities under control. So why does Germany agree to the armistice on 11th of November if its armies were still in the field? Well, it's quite simple. They were holding on, it is true, but with every passing day, the situation gets progressively worse and brings a final, inevitable collapse closer. Events at the front, I think, prove how wise and indeed inevitable this decision was. The small but significant action at Monthouy on 1st of November shows what lay in store for the German army had it continued to resist. Now, I've been told that people from Michigan don't like Canadians. And if that is true, then you might want to look away now. The hill of Monthouy commanded the town of Valenciennes, and by the end of October, a number of British attacks had come to nothing against strong German units heavily dug in. It was then that Sir Arthur Currie and the Canadian Corps moved up to the line and agreed to capture it. But Currie says, okay, if you want me to do this, I need one thing from you. I need every single gun you can get your hand on, and I need every single round of ammunition. A report on the operation concludes, owing to the fact that the German army was approaching a defeat on a grand scale and that there was much peace talk in the air, it was decided that all restrictions concerning the economical use of supporting arms were now out of place, and it was therefore the proper time to neglect economy. 6 brigades of field artillery and 104 heavy guns, supported by 9 batteries of heavy machine guns, were brought up to the front. For anyone that doesn't know, that is an awful lot of firepower. Because of the layout of the ground, it was possible to deploy a great deal of artillery forward and enable a combination of not only frontal artillery fire, but also oblique enfilade and incredibly reverse fire. Just one Canadian brigade went up the hill on 1st of November, supported by what historians have judged to be one of the most intensive fire plans of the war. During the attack, 7 tons of high explosive were fired every minute on a front of less than 2 miles. Some people have suggested that it's almost the most concentrated use of firepower before the atomic bomb. It is little wonder that the American historian Scott Stevenson wrote that to be a German defender in the path of a major Allied attack later in the war was to experience the horrors of Dante's Inferno. One of Currie's staff officers wrote this. It's a description of basically the carnage that he finds on that hill. In total, the Germans suffered 800 dead. The Canadians had suffered just 60 fatalities, an astonishingly light figure given the strength of the enemy defenses and the limited number of attackers. It's worth bearing in mind that the Germans are heavily dug in and that the Germans outnumber the Canadians 3-1. Yet the Canadians basically inflict 10 times as many casualties as they receive. Monthouy was the face of battle in 1918. The nightmare of the Somme had been well and truly banished. This was about as effective as war on the Western Front was ever going to get. If anyone tells you the Allies did not learn anything from the war, simply say Monthouy. For Germany, it's the end of the road. Crown Prince Ruprecht notes sadly that what we must therefore do, if we are to avoid a military catastrophe which will destroy our whole future as a nation, is to make haste and approach our enemies, and especially England, with peace offers, which both can be accepted and, in view of the temper of the English people, must be accepted. Ruprecht knew the war was lost. The only question was whether they could save enough of the army for the greater battle they could see looming, the fight against the Bolsheviks at home and the struggle for the German soul. If the army was destroyed and the Allies marched into the fatherland, then more than a war would have been lost. There was an urgent need to ward off something that was, in his words, far worse. Ludendorff was finally sacked on 26th of October to be replaced by General Wilhelm Groener, not perhaps the most recognizable German general, but a solid choice. He was not a firebrand Prussian, but someone who had spent the war running Germany's railway network and who was familiar with the political situation in Berlin. If anyone could arrange a strategic retreat, it would be Groener. And now the drama moves to the Kaiser. The Kaiser's last day is 9th of November, and it is really the final moments of Imperial Germany as it crumbles under pressure from all sides. That day he has been in deep discussions with Hindenburg and their generals at his villa in the Belgian city of Mons, arguing over the state of the war and whether the army would hold firm. Until now, the Kaiser had steadfastly refused to offer any political concessions, had still believed that the army was loyal to him. If he went, he said repeatedly, there would be total anarchy in Germany. It was up to Groener to dispel what he called the fantasy world the Kaiser and his aides lived in. He believed that the army's morale was breaking and the loyalty to the Kaiser was tottering. German soldiers would never agree to mount an operation within their homeland against the socialists, so something had to give. In the end, Groener tells the Kaiser, and this must have taken some courage, that the army no longer supports His Majesty, and although they would march back to Germany peacefully and orderly, they would not follow his orders. This was the final words that the Kaiser tells Groener. Bitter, very, very bitter. Within hours, the Kaiser is heading for the Dutch border, aware that revolution is stalking the country, and afraid that mutinous troops are actually marching on Spa. Well, here's the man, General Groener. A quote is basically his reaction to what he did, his explanation. Groener's stand was a remarkably courageous thing to do, and nationalists did not take long to accuse him of treachery and defeatism. Nevertheless, Groener seems to have a much deeper, objective awareness of how perilous Germany's situation was now, how fragile the army had become, and how it needed peace at any price. 4 days earlier, Groener had received a letter from a divisional commander at the front who was an old friend, Major General Loeffler, commander of 192nd Division. It told a story of exhaustion and despair that was shocking. "My dear Groener," Loeffler began, "I am writing to you because from the general headquarters, insight into the troops doesn't penetrate deeply enough to measure combat strength by its actual value. The strength of the troops is running out. You know me well enough to know that I am not a pessimist. My division hasn't had a single day of rest since the beginning of May. For weeks and months on end, only bivouacs have been possible. There's been no talk of proper sanitizing, delousing, and the like for just as long. From what I have been able to gather, it has been the same with every other division. Yet we've done our part. Every day brings proof of that. The moment of overturning is, however, no doubt approaching. It is no longer a matter of weeks. Eventually there comes a time when every action fails due to fatigue. It is into this state that we are now entering." Authorized by the Kaiser, the German armistice delegation met Foch on 8th of November, signing an armistice 3 days later and bringing the Great War to an end. The story of the 100 Days is, as I chronicle in the book, an epic tale of slaughter and sacrifice, heroism and tragedy. I have tried to show what it was like to experience the twilight of the Western Front, the shattering bombardments, the storm of machine gun fire, the sight of hundreds of dead and wounded, the exhaustion of endless marches, the glow of burning villages, the comradeship and fear. Should the war have continued? Could the Allies have kept going? Why did they not enter Germany and force a total, unconditional surrender like 1945? These questions remain difficult to answer and riven with controversy. There is no doubt that the Allies would have found it enormously difficult to maintain their advance into November and December. The spearhead of the BEF, its Fourth Army, was now 50 miles from its railheads by the Armistice, and only kept supplied via a handful of narrow, thinly cobbled roads. Many units were lacking reinforcements, increasingly unhappy at being asked to keep going, and most importantly, approaching the limit of their physical capability. And as we know, nobody wants to die when a war is about to end. There can be no definitive answer to what would have happened had the war gone on. This is counterfactual terrain. But a complete collapse of German resistance in 1918 is probably unlikely. Large sections of the army would probably have escaped their pursuers and slipped across the Rhine, particularly given the difficulty the Allies were having in keeping up, which became harder with every mile they covered, every village they liberated, and every river they crossed. More than likely, a new offensive would have been necessary in early spring of 1919 to finish off the Germans, which would have been militarily possible, but would have put both the British and French governments under intense domestic pressure to stop the war. Nevertheless, in hindsight, I suspect the Allies should have kept going, whatever the cost, something that General Pershing was definitely advocating. Only through the systematic breaking up of Germany and the reversal of the unification of 1871 could France's long-term security be assured. Yet the partial victory of 1918, which left Germany weakened and constrained but not crushed, meant that there was always a possibility she would rise again. But war weariness, combined with Woodrow Wilson's opposition to too much interference in Germany, meant that there would be no radical reshaping of the fatherland and no military occupation except for the Rhineland. Thus began the long and sad progress of 2 decades of missed opportunities and appeasement, when the Allies collectively let slip the priceless advantage they had gained after the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918. While some celebrated on 11th of November, particularly on the streets of Paris and London, for the vast majority of Allied soldiers, the news was received with relief and happiness, but alongside an overwhelming sense of loss and despair and grief. That's Tom's grave. 10 million soldiers had died, including my great-uncle. Another 20 million had been wounded or scarred forever. Large parts of Europe were ablaze. 4 empires had collapsed into a sea of conflicting nationalities and ethnic groups vying for power and influence. The Armistice may have brought the fighting in France to an end, but in one form or another, the war would go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd, for that insightful lecture. Directly following our Q&A session, there will be a book signing of Dr. Lloyd's book, 100 Days. The floor is now open for questions.
So on November 11th, what was the distribution of troops? I mean, were the lines pretty much as they had been the previous months, or was there some sort of a retreating by the Germans?
I think I can probably go back in the slides, actually. If we go back to the first map, that's basically the blue line. Don't look at the shaded bits, but the blue line is basically the Western Front between end of 14 to beginning of 18. It stays pretty much like that. By the end of the war, if you can imagine from the bottom, it just simply goes straight up. So you've got to the point where most of Belgium is now liberated, and you are closing in on the German border. So you've crossed that. So that line is well and truly gone. But the myth does persist that the line doesn't actually move. And there was a television program in the UK, Birdsong. It's a terrible book and it's a terrible film. At the end of the war, the chap that gets buried, he's on the Somme. And the whole point of it is that the line doesn't move. And it's a complete myth, actually. The line, by the time they get to the last phase of 1918, they are getting closer and closer to the German border. And the old battlefields of the Somme and Passchendaele have been left far behind. The problem is, though, that getting all that kit and oil and ammunition through those battlefields is very, very difficult.
Hi, I just have a question about your research process. You mentioned that you were looking at some letters that no one else had probably looked at yet. I was wondering what drew you to those, and also if they were hard to access.
I think you probably answered your own question. The fact that no one had looked at them before was ideal, really. So much of historical research is, you are based on, you're looking at well-worn sources that annoyingly people have already looked at. So you try and look for things that haven't been seen before. And that's really what I managed to find a copy of these letters, and I thought this is great stuff, particularly the kind of vivid descriptions that Hockheimer describes Ludendorff. I thought this was wonderful. So really, as a historian, you do try and look at what everyone else has looked at, perhaps read it in a different way, but you are always searching for the, if you like, the holy grail of a source that's completely pristine and new and radically transforms your opinion of a certain topic. It doesn't really exist very often, but it's the search that all historians go on, I think.
are there any statistics on the incidence of suicide among the combatants?
I think that's a very interesting question. It is not one I have an answer for. In terms of those people who were self-inflicted wounds, that kind of thing, you do get that. In terms of suicide, I'm not sure I'd really know about that question. Do you have a particular... I mean, personally, I find the Western Front depressing enough as it is without going searching for suicide.
Was poison gas pretty well over as far as an offensive weapon at that time?
It is used quite extensively in 1918. And not so much as an offensive weapon. The Germans use lots of mustard gas as a defensive weapon because you can fire that stuff and basically you can fire it at map references and you can basically block out whole map references with, because this stuff, mustard gas is terrible because it stays in the ground. So it can remain infected for weeks on end, so you can't move troops through it because you get infected. So what the Germans do, as well as using artillery and barbed wire, they fire thousands and thousands of shells of mustard gas as they retreat. So it means that the Allies are moving forward in a chemical environment, which slows them down even more. The British do use mustard gas as an offensive weapon. It's proved particularly effective at counter-battery fire. Earlier in the war, you used gas in terms of cloud attacks. You get loads of big cylinders in the front line and try and get the gas to go over the trenches. And that never really works because you're at the mercy of the weather and the right wind direction. So what they do is they begin to use more and more amounts of gas, firing it on German batteries. Because even if they don't hit the German battery and knock it out by physical means, the fact that you've got a cloud of gas means that it's much more difficult to operate those guns. So 1918 is a chemical battlefield. You're absolutely right.
Can you hear me all right? I suppose so.
Yeah,
my father, my father was in World War II. I mean World War I, and he was in the Royal Air Force. And I noticed that you haven't mentioned, and many of the speakers in this whole session have not spoken much about aircraft and warfare in the air. The things he mentioned most to me, which this is a long time ago, he said when they would move in France, they would go from one farmer's field to another, and then as the troops moved on, they would have to get another farmer's field, to fly from. And what really impressed him, though I think a lot of people here would recognize it, that the one thing he enjoyed the most, or remembers the most, is whenever they moved from one field to another, the Salvation Army was always there before they got there. And he was, of course, has made him a lifelong supporter of the Salvation Army. But why is it that we haven't had much mention of air power?
There's very good mentions in the book, so. No, you're absolutely right. Air power is a key element. I think I don't mention it because there's so much else to get through. Air power is critical to Allied success at the end of the war, and it's actually becomes very, very sophisticated what they're doing with air power, and they're trying to integrate it much more effectively with ground troops. By 1918, the Royal Air Force is photographing the entire British sector of the Western Front twice a day, every day. That's over 80 miles of front. You can imagine what kind of intelligence picture that gives. It's almost unprecedented. They're helping the artillery. They're even dropping supplies. They're dropping ammunition. They're dropping water on the front troops, particularly given the supply problems they have in 100 days. They're also beginning to experiment with putting wireless sets into tanks so that tanks can communicate with air power to try and help tanks knock out enemy anti-tank batteries. So you can really see air power becomes, it becomes into its own very much in the later stages of 1918 and plays a key role. And I think just some of the things they're trying to do with air power in 1918 is really revolutionary and forward-looking. Given that the Wright brothers only flew in 1903, by 1918 you have the birth of modern 3D warfare. And that's the end point of the learning curve. It's how to, you need to basically invent the kit first, inventing air power, inventing bomb sites, inventing weaponry, inventing better engines, and you have to then work out how you use it, and then you have to integrate it with tanks, with artillery, with air power. So I think when you look at it from that perspective, air power is absolutely critical and is a key element of what we call the learning curve.
Just two quick questions. Did Germany have an air force? You never hear anything about that.
They did, but it was shut down.
They got shot down?
They did have an air force. It was very good. Obviously, you may have heard of Baron von Manfred von Richthofen. He is not around at this time. He's been shot down. But one of the problems the Germans have by 1918 is they're running out of fuel. So they're not able to mount the kind of sorties that they... Every so often they can get a group of aircraft and mount a sort of small range sortie. But they don't have the numbers of aircraft that the Allies have. They're not able to contest control of the air on any kind of operational level. And by the 100 days, they're having to, it's in some ways like the Second World War, they're having to draft in trainee pilots. All the aces have been killed, all the big names have been killed by this point. And they don't have the kit. They have some excellent aircraft, but there's not that many of them, and the Allies are just blowing them out of the sky.
One last point. Was there a point where trench warfare ended and then became offensive? There wasn't trench warfare through the whole war, was there?
No, not really. I mean, basically, you have the trench deadlock is broken in March 1918 with the German spring offensive. That's when Germany basically gambles. They say, right, we've taken Russia out of the war, we're going to bring everyone now to the west for the final battle, and we're going to win the war. So once the Germans break out of that trench deadlock in 1918, using some pretty innovative tactics, from that moment onward, trench warfare as we know it is over. And from that moment, it's semi-mobile.
Yes, sir. Could you tell us something about the Eastern Front between the Brits and the Germans? Sizes of the events and where they took place, etc.?
You mean the Eastern Front between Russia, the Russian Empire, and Germany?
Well, there were Brits in the East.
I mean,
We're talking about Holy Land area.
Oh, you mean the Eastern Front is in Middle East. Sorry, I beg your pardon. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire is on its last legs, and you have a series of climactic battles where Allenby's British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, as it's called, goes up all the way through Palestine, I think all the way to Aleppo, and destroys the Ottoman Empire. They also destroy it in Mesopotamia. So that basically, the Ottoman Empire is confined basically to what would be sort of modern-day Turkey. And they suffer the same problems that the Germans have, lack of officers, lack of complete collapse in morale, and so on and so forth. This really happens at the same time as the 100 Days. It happens in September. You have the Great Battle of Megiddo, which is where the Turkish army is basically routed. And then cavalry columns follow them all the way up the coast.
You mentioned the possibility of a Bolshevik revolution in Berlin. Would you comment on how realistic that was? And also, the Western powers, the victorious Western powers, demanded the German renunciation of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I've often wondered why we sort of played, we basically played into the hands, if you will, of the new Soviet government, and perhaps didn't, maybe not giving Germany anything, but perhaps insisted on some concessions from them.
I think it's a difficult one because that whole area is in chaos. So you don't have the power. The Allies don't have the power to actually have some kind of order in that region. So they're trying to make the best of it, and they're trying to clearly make sure that Germany does not secure an empire in the East. Now, clearly, whether the Soviets were a worse danger, certainly some people in the British War Cabinet believed so. Winston Churchill, for example, is very keen on destroying Bolshevism at this point. But again, you have a choice. What do we do? We've got the pressure on Germany, so that's really the only lever we have. We barely have any contact with Bolshevik Russia. The likelihood of a revolution in 1919 or 1918 in Germany, you have a revolution in Munich, in Bavaria. Certain people were very worried that this could happen. If you read any of Adolf Hitler's works, he's always talking about the chaos that inflicted on Germany in 1918, 1919. But of course, you have a lot of returning soldiers who join what they call Freikorps, Free Corps units that go and take on the Bolsheviks in Berlin. So there clearly is a possibility. I'm not really sure how close they came to revolution. I suspect it was never that likely, but there clearly is a significant threat there.
In the last 100 days, to what extent do General Montgomery and General Patton get to use their techniques on tank warfare that they take into World War II?
I think, Patton, obviously he has his little brief experience of combat in the Meuse-Argonne, and then goes on to sort of talk a lot more about tank warfare. Clearly tanks aren't going to be very useful in the Meuse-Argonne because the terrain is so bad. So I think it's an example of where you don't fight. You don't fight in the Meuse-Argonne. Don't fight in the woods. You know, I think Sun Tzu tells that. As for Montgomery, I think Montgomery is interesting because Montgomery, if you look at the British Army in the Second World War from 1942 onwards, they basically do First World War battles. Massive artillery support, a structured battle, so we're going to go this far and no further. We're going to, the British Army is not capable of doing the sophisticated maneuver warfare that the Germans are so good at. So basically what we're going to do is just take this line and no further. So if you like, the Montgomery is a product of the First World War, and he's involved in the 100 Days as I think he's a colonel in one of the divisions. And this for them is how you do it. You do limited attacks using overwhelming artillery fire, and you don't ask too much of the men because, frankly, they're not up to it.
This will be our final question.
Yes, hello. It was mentioned earlier about the potential state prior to the revolution of the Eastern Front between the Germans and Bolsheviks, and could you tell a bit more about the state of the war leading up to the end at that point?
Well, obviously you have the Russians basically give up at the back end of 16. There are some offensives in 17, but when you have the revolution, it's in the spring, and then finally in October, the Bolshevik Revolution, they really give up. The army begins to go home. The Germans then advance deeper and deeper into Russia to compel some kind of surrender. And so by early 1918, several weeks before the spring offensive in the west, they compel the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on Russia, or the Soviet Union, which is a very horrendous peace. Most of Western Russia now comes under German control, or at least German theoretical control. By this point, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire is on its last legs as well. They are on the point of collapse, huge problems internally. So the whole, we tend to think of wars coming to an end as being kind of clean and crisp, or at least we used to. This whole Central and Eastern Europe is in complete chaos. But for Germany, it becomes increasingly clear that the Eastern Empire is a key war aim. So even though they bring an awful lot of the best troops back in the West for that final blow, they still have 1 million men in the East trying to secure Ukrainian wheat fields and bases on the Black Sea and so on and so forth. And that is the sort of stasis, that fluid situation where Germany has effectively won in the East. It has won the war in the East. It is able to destroy Poland and destroy Lithuania and the Baltic states, but simply cannot win in the West. You could argue actually what they should have done in the spring of 1918 is simply put everyone in the West and then not attacked, and then had some kind of negotiation, because in the East they had won.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd.
Thanks very much.
Oh, fine. Thank you again, Dr. Lloyd. We will be having the reception right after, and students, as a reminder, please use the stairway to the left. Thank you.